I never wanted my husband's money. 5 minutes before he signed his entire fortune over to me, I was ready to walk out of our marriage forever. The conference room was completely silent, except for the sound of legal papers sliding across a polished oak table. Ethan looked directly at me. Not at his mother, not at his brother, just me. He told me not to interrupt, no matter what anyone said next. His mother shot to her feet. His brother slammed both hands onto the table and called me a fraud. And while everyone in that room believed I was about to become the wealthiest person in the room, all I could think about was a single question that had been burning inside me for the past hour. What if accepting everything he was offering meant I had just walked into the same trap my husband had spent his entire life trying to escape? But to understand how we got here, we have to go back to the beginning. I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Dayton, Ohio, where the heat worked most of the time, and the refrigerator made a sound like a dying engine every time it cycled on. My mother worked double shifts at a hospital laundry, and my father worked sporadically, when the casinos were losing his interest and when the bottle wasn't winning. By the time I was 11 years old, I understood exactly what it meant when my mother sat at the kitchen table after midnight, spreading unpaid bills across the linoleum like she was reading fortunes she already knew were bad. I watched money do something terrible to my family, not the absence of it, though that was brutal enough. What I watched was more specific than that. I watched what happened to people when money became the center of everything, when the hope of it replaced the reality of what was right in front of them. My father didn't start as a cruel man. He started as a man who believed that one big win would fix everything broken in his life, and that belief slowly swallowed him whole. By the time I was 15, he was gone. Not dead, just gone. Which was somehow harder to explain to people and harder to carry than the alternative would have been. My mother never remarried. She never complained, at least not where I could hear it. She worked and saved and kept the lights on, and she told me quietly and repeatedly that a person's character was the only thing no one could ever repossess. I believed her. I built my whole life around that idea. The way you build around something that you know from experience is load-bearing. I became an elementary school teacher, not because it was easy. It wasn't, but because I loved children, and because I believed that one good year with a trusted adult could alter the direction of everything that came after. I rented a small apartment, drove a reliable used car, and lived comfortably within my means. Not because I lacked ambition, but because I had already seen in high definition what happened when ambition turned into desperation, and desperation became the only thing steering a person's life. I was 30 years old when I met Ethan Whitmore. And I want to be clear about one thing. I had no idea who he was. He walked into the spring fundraiser at my school, wearing a dark blue jacket and no tie, carrying a check that was 5 times the amount of any donation we had ever received. The principal nearly fainted. I was in the gymnasium helping 3rd graders glue cotton clouds onto painted sky backdrops when someone came to find me because the man apparently wanted to speak with the teacher who had organized the science exhibit. I didn't know what I was expecting. I certainly wasn't expecting someone who crouched down to a child's eye level the moment he walked in and asked a 7-year-old girl, with complete seriousness, what she believed clouds were made of. The girl told him marshmallows. Ethan nodded like that was the most reasonable answer he'd ever received. We talked for nearly 2 hours that afternoon. He didn't mention Whitmore Holdings. He didn't mention the family estate or the company or any of it. We talked about education funding, about what public schools desperately needed and weren't getting, about a book we'd each read in different decades and remembered in completely different ways. He was calm in a manner I hadn't encountered much, not passive, not distant, but genuinely still, like a man who had nothing left to prove and had made that decision some time ago and was at peace with it. He asked if he could take me to dinner. I said yes. He arrived in a car I later learned cost more than my annual salary. I didn't find out the full extent of who he was until our 3rd date, when a stranger at a restaurant recognized him, and I finally searched his name on my walk home. I stopped on the sidewalk under a streetlight and read for 10 minutes in the cold. Then I stood there a little longer, thinking. I almost didn't call him again. Not because of the money, because of what I already knew money could do. I had made a quiet, serious promise to myself years earlier that I would never allow wealth to determine who I loved, because I had watched too many people I cared about be undone by exactly that calculation. I was genuinely afraid of what loving a man with that kind of fortune might eventually do to my judgment. Whether I'd slowly drift towards someone I didn't want to be, Whether I'd stop being honest and start being careful in the wrong ways. I called him anyway, because he had crouched down to talk to a 7-year-old about marshmallows, and I couldn't shake the image. Some things you can analyze and some things just land differently than everything else. We dated for 14 months. During that time, he was patient and consistent and curious about my life, with an attention that felt nothing like performance. He met my mother, he fixed her bathroom faucet without being asked, and then sat with her for an hour talking about Dayton in the 70s. She called me afterward and said, quietly and very deliberately, "That man is good." My mother was not a woman who said things she didn't mean. We married in early spring on a Saturday that was warmer than anyone predicted. Small ceremony. My co-workers, his college roommate, Margaret Lewis, the family estate attorney, who served as a witness and said very little, but observed everything. Victoria Whitmore did not attend. She had made her feelings about our relationship known months earlier, in private and unmistakably, and I had chosen not to tell Ethan the full extent of what she said. I told myself it was because I didn't want to burden him with it. The truth, which took me longer to admit, was that I didn't want to test what he would do. What Victoria said to me, the first and only time we were ever alone before the wedding, was delivered with a controlled smile and very measured words. She told me I was a pleasant enough woman, but that I was not a Whitmore, that my background was not an asset to this family, that Ethan had always been the sentimental one, and she had always found sentimentality expensive. She didn't threaten me directly. She was far too experienced for that. She simply made it clear she was watching, and that she had patience. I should have told Ethan everything that same day. The first year of our marriage was the happiest I had ever known. Ethan was exactly who he'd been while we were dating. Present, thoughtful, honest with me in all the ways that mattered. We bought a house in Louisville. Not a mansion, just a house with a porch and a good kitchen and a yard where I planted tomatoes that actually came up. I kept teaching, he kept working. We built something that felt genuinely ours, not a production for anyone else's consumption. But something began shifting in the second year, and I noticed it the way you notice a change in weather before the sky actually changes, through feeling rather than evidence. Ethan started bringing work home in ways he hadn't before. Not physically, he was always present when he was home, but mentally, I could feel him somewhere else. He started locking the door to his office, something he'd never done. He took phone calls before dawn, stepping outside so as not to wake me. He traveled more frequently, and when he returned, he was quieter in a way that felt guarded rather than simply tired. I told myself I was reading too much into it. I told myself that marriages naturally evolved, and that not every closed door was a sign. I kept telling myself things that were easier than asking the question directly. Daniel Whitmore was the one who finally asked it for me. Ethan's older brother had the kind of charm that worked efficiently on people who weren't paying close attention. He was polished and deliberate, and had perfected the habit of making you feel specifically selected when he turned his full attention toward you. He had never been particularly warm to me before our marriage, which made it notable when he began calling, not Ethan, me, and inviting me to lunches that were framed as casual family connection. Over the course of 3 months, Daniel told me things. Carefully, slowly, never all at once. He told me that Ethan had been under enormous financial pressure at the company, that he had made decisions that had hurt people, and that the family was working to protect him from the consequences. He told me there were personal accounts, hidden from the company and from me, that suggested Ethan was quietly moving money, preparing for something. He said all of it like a man who was reluctant to share it, like someone carrying information that was costing him something. Each time we met, he added one more piece. Each piece was designed to land exactly where the last one had already loosened something. And the devastating truth is that he was very, very good at it. He had found the precise architecture of my fears, the childhood spent watching money hollow out a man I once loved, and he pressed against it with surgical patience. I want to be honest about what happened to me during those 3 months. I stopped sleeping well. I started watching Ethan with a quieter, more painful kind of attention. Not with love, but with the horrible scrutiny you turn on someone you're afraid you've been badly wrong about. I started asking myself whether the man who had crouched down for marshmallow conversations had been someone I had invented, whether my judgment was as broken as my father's had always been. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in October, I found the files. Ethan had left for a meeting without closing his office door. I went in to leave a book on his desk, nothing more than that, and the laptop was open, and a folder was displayed across the screen that I would have needed to be deliberately blind to walk past. The folder was labeled with the initials WH. What was inside it was not what Daniel had spent 3 months preparing me to find. It was a financial investigation, thousands of pages, transaction records, shell corporation registrations, internal memos, correspondence between executives and offshore accounts. Names were highlighted throughout in red, and Daniel's name appeared more than any other, by a significant margin. There were legal annotations in Ethan's handwriting on dozens of pages, careful and cross-referenced, linking dates and amounts and personnel in a chain of documentation that had not been assembled quickly or carelessly. This had taken years. My hands were shaking, not from fear, from the clarifying, disorienting recognition of what I was actually looking at. Ethan was not the one hiding money. He had been spending years building a case against the people who were. And in that moment, the entire architecture Daniel had so carefully constructed inside my mind collapsed completely and silently, the way things fall in a dream, without sound, without warning, leaving only the aftermath. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. I sat in that office for a long time. The afternoon light through the window shifted and cooled. I could hear the house settle around me, and I went through everything I could access, not to violate his trust, but because I needed to understand the full shape of what he had been carrying alone, and more importantly, why he hadn't trusted me enough to carry it with him. What I found over the next 2 hours rebuilt the story from the ground up. Ethan had discovered the financial irregularities 3 years before we even met. He'd noticed discrepancies in company accounts that didn't match the reports being filed with regulators. When he'd brought the concerns to his mother, she had dismissed him, and then quietly reassigned him within the company in a move that looked externally like a promotion, but functionally removed him from any financial oversight. He had started gathering evidence on his own after that. He retained a private forensic accountant through a law firm, entirely separate from the family's legal team. He had been building a sealed, documented case for years, and he had done it alone. The deeper I read, the sharper the picture became. Daniel had been siphoning company funds through a network of shell corporations for at least 6 years. Victoria had not initiated the theft, but she had known about it for at least 2 years, and had made the deliberate choice to protect the family name over the employees and investors being quietly defrauded. There were pension funds involved. Ordinary working people with no connection to the Whitmore name, whose retirement accounts were being methodically drained by people they had never met and would never have cause to suspect. Ethan was not protecting himself from any of this. He was protecting them. But there was one more document in the folder, and it was the one that stopped me entirely. It was a letter to Margaret Lewis, dated 2 weeks earlier, and it outlined in precise legal language a plan to transfer the entirety of Ethan's personal holdings, every property, every account, every share he personally owned, into my name before the investigation became public. His reasoning was detailed in an attached memo. If the criminal charges moved forward, the family would attempt to freeze all Whitmore-affiliated assets, and Ethan's personal holdings could be swept into that action, tied up in litigation for years, or lost entirely to legal maneuvering by people who had every incentive to complicate things. But if those assets were transferred to me, to someone with no corporate exposure, no connection to the company, and a name that appeared nowhere in any of these documents, they would be protected from the storm that was coming. He had planned this carefully. He had built this specific legal protection for me, and I had spent 3 months being systematically convinced by his brother that he was the one I should be afraid of. I closed the laptop. I sat in the chair as the room went dark around me, and I thought about my father. Not the man he became, but the man he started as, and how easy it had been for the slow accumulation of suspicion and financial pressure to rewrite him into someone unrecognizable. I thought about the promise I'd made to myself about money, about how certain I had been that I was immune to what it could do to a person's perception. I had not been immune. I had simply been slower than I realized. When Ethan came home that evening, I looked at him and felt something shift and resettle inside me. Not relief exactly, but something more complicated than that. Grief, for the 3 months I had spent doubting a man who had been building something designed to protect me. A fury at Daniel that I had to breathe through carefully before I could speak. And a fear that was quieter but just as real. because I now understood that whatever was coming was serious enough that Ethan had carried it for years alone, and that he had made that choice, which meant something about what he thought I could or couldn't handle. The next morning he looked at me across the breakfast table for a long moment. Then he said he needed to tell me something. He told me everything. Not all at once, and not without effort. He was a man who had learned to keep things close, and years of necessary silence were not a habit he broke easily, or without cost. But he told me about the discrepancies he'd first found, about his mother's response when he brought them forward, about the years of careful, solitary documentation, about Daniel's escalating behavior as the investigation moved closer to completion, about Margaret and the transfer and why he had structured it the way he had. He told me he was sorry he hadn't trusted me with it sooner. He said he had convinced himself that the less I knew, the safer I was, that he was protecting me by keeping me outside of it, that by the time he understood that this reasoning was wrong, that protecting someone in the dark was not the same thing as protecting them, too much time had passed, and he didn't know how to go back to the beginning and begin again. I told him about Daniel. Every lunch, every carefully placed suggestion, the way he had used my own history against me, had identified the exact fears I had carried from my childhood and worked them with the patience of someone who had thought it through in advance. Ethan's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes went very quiet and very still in a way I had never seen before. He picked up his phone and called Margaret Lewis. The meeting was scheduled 3 days later. Victoria received a formal invitation to attend what was described as a routine estate review. Daniel was told the same thing. Neither of them was given any detail beyond that. What they didn't know was that Margaret had spent the preceding 2 weeks organizing the complete evidentiary package, every document, every transaction record, every corroborating piece of correspondence, and that copies had already been delivered, under seal, to the relevant regulatory authorities. The conference room on the 14th floor was not going to be a negotiation, it was going to be a notification. I almost didn't go, not because I was afraid of Victoria or Daniel, because in the hours before we left the house, I sat on the edge of our bed and I held the full weight of what the transfer actually meant. Every company, every property, every account, a fortune I had never asked for and had spent 2 years quietly keeping my distance from, now being placed entirely in my hands. And I thought about my father, about the promise I had made myself, about everyone I had ever watched be changed by exactly this kind of moment. Ethan sat beside me on the edge of the bed. He didn't push. He didn't offer reassurances that would have felt hollow. He just waited. Then he said something I have thought about many times since that morning. He told me the transfer was not about giving me his money. It was about trusting me with proof that he was the same man he had always been, that what he had built honestly, and that whatever came out of the room that day, he wanted me on the other side of it regardless of what I decided to do with any of it afterward. I stood up. I got dressed. We drove to the Whitmore Holdings building together, without speaking, and the silence between us was the most comfortable silence I had ever shared with another person. The conference room on the 14th floor had floor-to-ceiling windows and morning sun that flooded across the oak table like it had been arranged that way deliberately. Margaret was already seated at the head of the table when we arrived, her briefcase open, her expression composed and patient in the way of someone who has waited a long time for an appointment they knew was always coming. Victoria arrived 7 minutes later, impeccably dressed, as always, a woman who understood that presentation was its own form of argument. She looked at me when she entered, and then past me, which was also a form of argument, and one she had been making since the beginning. Daniel arrived last. He sat across from me, and for a moment our eyes met, and I watched him try to read my face. I gave him nothing to read. Margaret opened the first folder. Ethan picked up the pen. He looked at me, directly, steadily, without any of the things he might have said filling the silence, and told me quietly not to interrupt, no matter what anyone said next. Then he began to sign. The first signature went down clean and unhurried, and the sound in the room in the moment after was absolute silence. And then Victoria understood what she was watching, and she was on her feet before the second page was turned. She used every tool she had. She called it reckless and emotional. She reached for the register of words, specifically designed to find the part of him that had grown up wanting her approval, and she deployed them precisely and without hesitation. Ethan signed the second page without looking up. Daniel came for me then, which was exactly what I had expected and exactly what Ethan had prepared me for. He pointed across the table and told Margaret that the documents should be contested, that any court would see what was really happening, that I had orchestrated this from the beginning. He said the word calculated like it was something he could throw, and he threw it directly at me. I did not interrupt. Ethan signed the third page. Margaret, still seated, still composed, opened the second folder and slid a single document across the table. To Victoria first, then to Daniel. She gave them time to read it in full. The room went quiet in a different way after that. Not the silence of a pause, but the silence of an ending. The document was a clean, organized, precisely annotated summary of 6 years of financial crimes, corroborated with enough specificity that no attorney in that room could reasonably call it speculation. Victoria read it standing, her hand resting on the back of her chair. Daniel read it twice, very carefully, and set it back on the table with deliberate gentleness, as if he'd decided it was something to be handled carefully now. One of the executives who had been seated near the window stood up and walked out without saying anything at all. In its own way, that was the most clarifying moment in the room. Ethan signed the final page. Margaret closed the second folder and placed both hands flat on the table. She spoke without drama and without any particular urgency, because everything she said had already been arranged and the urgency had long passed. She explained that copies of the complete evidentiary package had been submitted to the Securities and Exchange Commission, to the State Attorney General's office, and to 2 separate federal agencies. She explained that Ethan's personal assets had been transferred in a manner that was legally clean, thoroughly documented, and entirely outside the scope of any litigation connected to the company. She explained that her role going forward would be to represent the interests of the new asset holder, which was me, and that any attempt to contest the transfer would require the contesting attorneys to first explain to a court why they had been in the building that morning and said nothing while the evidence was being filed. Victoria sat down slowly. The composure she wore so expertly was still arranged on her face, but something had gone out from behind it. Whatever she had always believed enough money could protect her from, she had just arrived at its limit. Daniel said nothing further. He sat with the summary document in front of him and did not touch it again. I sat in that chair and held everything that was moving through me without letting any of it cross my face. Not because I was performing strength, but because for the first time since I had walked into that building that morning, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. I felt certain. The signing was complete. The evidence was filed. The empire Ethan had grown up inside was entering a reckoning that would take years and multiple proceedings to fully resolve. 2 months after the conference room, Daniel was formally charged on 11 counts of securities fraud, wire fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. Victoria was not criminally charged, but a civil investigation found her personally liable for knowingly failing to report criminal activity within the company, and she resigned her chairmanship. She did not contest the resignation. Margaret handled every subsequent step with the same quiet professionalism she had brought to every stage of the process. She told me privately, in a later meeting, that she had possessed pieces of the evidence for longer than she liked to acknowledge, and that her one true regret was remaining silent as long as she had, out of a hope that the family would resolve its problems without outside intervention. The employees whose pension accounts had been drained never got everything back, but a significant portion was recovered through asset seizure, enough to make a real and lasting difference to the people it reached. As for the fortune Ethan transferred to me, I made decisions about it slowly and with help, and never in a rush. Some of it I liquidated. Some I restructured into functioning enterprises that retained their workers. A significant portion went into an educational foundation that still operates today, funding public school programs in 4 states, with the largest grants going to districts that looked a great deal like Dayton, Ohio, in the years when I was growing up there. I kept teaching. People ask me sometimes whether I regret the way it all unfolded, whether I wish Ethan had told me earlier, before Daniel had had enough time to plant things that needed uprooting. Whether I resent the months I spent doubting a man who was quietly assembling something built to protect me. I have turned that question over many times. Here is what I know. I spent the first 30 years of my life believing that money revealed the worst in people, and I had watched it happen enough times that I couldn't argue with the evidence. What I hadn't fully understood was that it reveals the best in people just as clearly, if you are paying attention to the right things, and if you have not already decided what you are going to see before you look. Ethan could have walked away from the corruption and simply protected himself. He could have taken his share and looked in another direction, the way people with a great deal to lose have always had the option to do. He didn't. He spent years building something that cost him his relationship with his mother and brother, that required him to carry a weight heavy enough to change the character of the air around him, that put him at genuine personal and legal risk, and at the center of all of it was not strategy, not ambition, but a man who could not tolerate the idea that ordinary people with pension accounts would lose what they had saved because powerful people had decided their interests didn't count. He grew up in a mansion. I grew up counting pennies, and what neither of us understood when we first found each other was that we had both grown up in households where money destroyed people, just from opposite ends of the same catastrophe. The pen touched the paper, the storm broke, and when it finally passed and the air cleared, and the room was quiet, and the documents were signed, and the truth was no longer something one person had to carry alone, we were still standing next to each other. That is the only inheritance that ever mattered. Sometimes the most valuable thing another person can give you is not money, not security, and not a name. It is the truth, finally spoken aloud, in the moment they've run out of reasons to protect you from it.